In Lecture 3, we continue our introduction to evolutionary psychology by considering the cognitive science perspective and the role of ethology in informing evolutionary psychology. In today's lecture, we'll introduce ourselves to the cognitive science perspective. First, we'll define cognitive science, and then we'll review David Marr's 3 levels of analysis in cognitive science. We'll then review ethology's 4 why questions and show how this leads to 5 questions that evolutionary cognitive science will ask. Those questions include the question of ontogeny, phylogeny, proximate and ultimate function, and finally the question of hardware. In regards to the key terms and concepts for this section of the course, we'll now turn our attention to Part 2 and look at several key terms associated with cognitive science and ethology. In the late 1890s, William James argued that if psychology wanted to become a natural science, it would have to abandon metaphysics and start borrowing the strategies of physiology and medicine. Psychology in the late 1800s, according to James, was hardly more than what physics was before Galileo, what chemistry was before Lavoisier. James' strategy was that by treating it like a natural science to help her become one. All natural sciences, according to James, aim at practical prediction and control. Writing in the late 1890s, William James argued that the problem with early scientific work in psychology was the tendency to distinguish and refine and specify in infinitum without ever getting onto another logical level. Whereas the beauty of all truly scientific work, according to James, is to get to ever deeper levels of understanding. To appreciate what William James meant by a deeper level of understanding, it will be helpful to consider 2 different types of explanation. The first level is proximate explanations that focus on how does it work. The second is the level of ultimate explanations with the question of what, if anything, is something designed to do. To understand the distinction between proximate and ultimate causes, let's consider the story of how my brother met his wife. My brother Dave first met Anne, his wife, in Los Angeles in the early 1990s. They fell in love and married in Tahoe, California 3 years later. Anne was the daughter of a UCLA geology professor, John Christie. John Christie's best friend was Donald McIntyre, a fellow Scotsman and classmate in the graduate program in geology at the University of Edinburgh. As a young graduate student, McIntyre spent several summers working in a winery in Switzerland. The winery was known for producing a particular sparkling wine. What made the wine especially noteworthy was neither its bouquet nor its taste, but rather the peculiar pattern of bubbles that floated upwards from the bottom of the glass. It was during a subsequent trip to Scotland, shortly after their marriage, that my brother and his wife had their first opportunity to meet Donald McIntyre. Sitting down to dinner that evening in McIntyre's isolated house on the dark Scottish moors, Mr. McIntyre stared across the table and asked my brother and his wife, "Have I ever told you two the story of how you two came to meet?" My brother was quite amused, of course, because he knew all the proximate details of the story firsthand. He first met Anne at a party one evening in 1991 while taking a break from his medical studies at UCLA. Yet, sitting at Donald McIntyre's dinner table, my brother recognized that he and his wife were in the hands of a capable raconteur. So he replied truthfully, "No, I don't believe that anyone has ever told us the story of how we two came to meet." Donald McIntyre proceeded to tell my brother and his wife about a summer that he spent between semesters of graduate school, working at a winery in Switzerland. He told them about the sparkling wine and the peculiar pattern of bubbles. He then described how he returned to Edinburgh, completed his graduate training, and was subsequently hired as an assistant professor at Pomona College in Claremont, California in the late 1950s. By virtue of his appointment at Pomona College, Donald had the opportunity to attend an academic conference in Los Angeles. It was at this geology conference that the young Scotsman encountered his first glimpse of the emerging California wine scene. At the reception following the day's proceedings, several UCLA professors, each of them aspiring wine snobs, thought that they would have a little fun at the expense of this young Scotsman. The California wine snobs called Donald McIntyre over from across the room, presuming that he knew more about single malt whiskeys than fine California vintages. Holding aloft a swirling glass of white wine, one of the professors beckoned Donald McIntyre near. "Tell us, my dear young Scotsman, what kind of California wine is this?" he sniffed contemptuously. As young Donald walked across the room, he noticed a strange pattern of bubbles floating up from the bottom of the glass, held aloft in the professor's hand. "Why, that doesn't look like a California wine at all," remarked Donald as he walked across the room. "In fact, it looks rather like a Swiss wine." The jaws of the wine snobs dropped, and they gasped, as they knew their little attempt at trickery had failed. For the glass of wine they held aloft was indeed a Swiss wine, not a California wine. As young Donald stepped closer, he declared, "I do believe that this is a Swiss wine." He rattled off the location of the winery where he had worked and the distinct claim to fame of this peculiar pattern of bubbles in this particular sparkling wine. The wine snobs were amazed. The young Scotsman had neither sniffed nor tasted this wine, and yet from a distance of 10 paces he had correctly identified the wine. They embraced the young Scotsman, shared wine with him until late in the evening, and at the end of the drinking offered him a position at UCLA. Young Donald regrettably informed them that he would have to decline their generous offer due to a previous commitment. However, he noted that he had a trusted colleague, John Christie, who would be perfect for this job. Shortly thereafter, John Christie was offered the position, moved to Los Angeles, and was soon appointed a professor in UCLA's Department of Geology. John Christie went on to make a name for himself in structural geology and microtectonics. He married his Scottish sweetheart Helen and raised a son and 2 daughters. One evening, when his youngest daughter was 22, she attended a party near the UCLA campus where she met a young medical student named Dave. And that is the story of how my brother came to meet his wife. Donald McIntyre's tale of how my brother came to meet his wife nicely illustrates the usefulness of invoking both proximate and ultimate causes when understanding cause and effect. Prior to meeting Donald McIntyre, my brother and his wife were quite familiar, intimate, you might say, with the proximate details of how they came to meet. Yet Donald McIntyre's story reminds us that lurking behind the immediate proximate details of our own experiences lie more distant ultimate causes. Just as my brother and his wife were initially familiar with the proximate causes of their meeting, but unfamiliar with the distant historical forces at play, so too I suspect that many psychologists are more familiar with proximate immediate causes than with the more distant or ultimate causes of behavior. What does it mean to describe something at ever deeper levels? A complete description of a psychological mechanism should do 2 things. First, it should allow for several levels of explanation. And second, it should connect empirical facts to theoretical assumptions. When we talk about allowing for several levels of explanation, a cognitive science approach, as we'll see, is one way of meeting this goal. When we're talking about connecting empirical facts to theoretical assumptions, we will review how evolutionary theory, in the form of the core logic of ethology, meets this goal. We've already seen an example of proximate versus ultimate levels of explanation when we reviewed the story of how my brother came to meet his wife. When we talk about connecting empirical facts to theoretical assumptions, we're simply saying that description should be theoretically based. Let's focus now on the idea of several levels of explanation. Let's begin by defining cognitive science. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary scientific study of the mind and its processes. It examines what cognition is, what it does, and how it works. Cognitive science includes research on intelligence and behavior, especially focusing on how information is represented, processed, and transformed in faculties such as perception, language, memory, reasoning, and emotion. Cognitive science consists of multiple research disciplines, including psychology, artificial intelligence, philosophy, neuroscience, linguistics, anthropology, sociology, and education. It spans several levels of analysis, from low-level learning and decision mechanisms to high-level logic and planning, from neural circuitry to modular brain organization. What does it mean to be a cognitive scientist? Several years ago, I was having dinner in 's-Hertogenbosch, Netherlands, with a colleague, Masanori Takazawa. During my conversation with Dr. Takazawa, we came to the realization that a cognitive scientist is simply a person who has read David Marr's book Vision and makes a similar distinction between 3 levels of analysis in psychology. Let's take a look now at David Marr's 3 levels of analysis in cognitive science. David Marr was a cognitive neuroscientist. Marr treated vision as an information processing system. In his book Vision, he put forth the idea that one must understand information processing systems at 3 distinct complementary levels of analysis. The philosopher Daniel Dennett, author of the book Consciousness Explained, reviews the important contributions of David Marr. Dennett writes that in his influential book Vision, published in 1982, the neuroscientist and artificial intelligence researcher David Marr proposed 3 levels of analysis that should be pursued in the attempt to explain any mental phenomena. Marr recommended modeling psychological phenomena at all 3 levels of analysis, and he particularly stressed the importance of getting clear about the top computational level before rushing headlong into lower-level modeling. According to Marr, the top or most abstract level, the computational level, is an analysis of the problem as an information processing task, while the middle or algorithmic level is an analysis of the actual processes by which the information processing task is performed. The lowest or physical level provides an analysis of the neural machinery and shows how it executes the algorithms described in the middle level, thereby performing its task as abstractly described at the computational level. Dennett notes that the highest level, which David Marr misleadingly calls the computational level, is in fact not at all concerned with computational processes, but strictly and more abstractly with the question of what function the system in question is serving. Marr claims that until we get a clear and precise understanding of the activity of a system at its highest computational level, we cannot properly address detailed questions at the lower levels. There are 3 levels of description in cognitive science, according to David Marr. The first level, the computational level, or what we refer to as the ultimate functions level, refers to what, if anything, is the system designed to do. This first level provides a description of the problem that is solved by this cognitive mechanism. The second level, what David Marr referred to as the algorithm level, is a description of the proximate mechanisms. How does it work? The algorithmic level provides a description of the circuitry and how it operates. Marr's third level of description, the hardware level, describes what is it made out of, and it provides a description of the physical basis of the circuitry underlying the psychological mechanism. We now turn our attention to the second feature of a complete description of a psychological mechanism and examine how the core logic of ethology and evolutionary theory allows us to connect empirical facts to theoretical assumptions. We'll now turn our attention to ethology's 4 why questions. You'll recall that over a century ago, William James argued that if psychology wanted to become a natural science, it would have to borrow the strategies of physiology and medicine. Ethology, or the science of animal behavior, is generally considered to have begun in the early part of the 20th century with the work of Dutch biologists Nicholas Tinbergen and Austrian biologists Konrad Lorenz and Karl von Frisch. These 3 individuals were jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1973. The zoologist Robert Hind points out that the award of the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology to Karl von Frisch, Konrad Lorenz, and Nico Tinbergen in 1973 marks the full emergence of the study of animal behavior from one of the less respectable corners of natural history to the forefront of the biological sciences. The 4 questions of ethology have their origins in Tinbergen's work. In October 1962, Nico Tinbergen wrote confidentially to Otto Kahler to recommend the preparation of a festschrift or party for Konrad Lorenz on the occasion of his 60th birthday the following year. The following February, he announced the subject on which he had decided to write. After long doubts, I now know what I'm going to write for Konrad's festschrift, wrote Tinbergen, and I'm now sitting every free hour at the typewriter. I want to write something for Konrad that he likes a lot. I'm now writing some thoughts about don't panic. What is ethology? And so Tinbergen's famous paper on the aims and methods of ethology helped to establish the famous 4 why questions of ethology. 2 of the 4 why questions are questions about ultimate causes, including the question of function and the question of phylogeny. The other 2 questions concern proximate causes, and they include the question of proximate mechanisms and the question of ontogeny or development. The question of function or adaptation asks, what is the adaptive problem of survival or reproduction that this behavioral trait was designed to solve? Whereas the question of phylogeny or evolutionary history asks, how did this behavioral trait evolve? Turning to the 2 questions revolving proximate causes, the question of proximate mechanisms asks, how does this behavioral trait work? What are the stimuli that activate it? What are the actual behaviors it produces? Finally, the question of ontogeny or development asks, how does this behavioral trait develop? Now let's consider how ethology's 4 why questions combine with cognitive science's 3 levels of analysis to result in 5 key questions from an evolutionary cognitive science perspective. Evolutionary cognitive science combines insights from ethology and cognitive science. From cognitive science, of course, we get 3 levels of description. This corresponds to 3 questions. What, if anything, is the system designed to do? How does it work? And what is it made out of? Although the question of hardware was not one of the 4 questions of ethology that Tinbergen proposed, the question of ultimate function and proximate function surely were. Now, when you add the final 2 questions from ethology's 4 questions, you get the questions of how did it evolve and how did it develop. Thus, cognitive science and ethology combine to create 5 questions.